Olga Cojocaru. Thank you for talking to us in this NEC Fellow series. You are a Pontica Magna Fellow here at NEC this academic year. Could you tell us more about your academic background?
Mm-hmm. Certainly. I do have a background in communication and anthropology. So I do have a bachelor degree in communication and a master degree in anthropology from the National School of Political Science and Public Administration here in Bucharest. That's a long title. And then I have a second master degree in anthropology from Central European University in Budapest. And currently I am finishing off my doctoral thesis at the University of Warsaw, more specifically at the Center of Migration Research. And the thesis is in migration studies.
Your research topic of the thesis is migration of Eastern Europeans, and in particular Moldovan to Italy. And this is in relation also with the project here at NEC. Before talking more in detail about your project, what is the overall framework of your PhD thesis?
Well, in my thesis I am trying to propose a temporal framework of studying migration. Migration has been rarely studied in terms of temporal length. So what I'm trying in my thesis is to study migration in terms of time qualities and life planning. And more specifically, I'm looking at this case of migration, Moldovans in Italy, in terms of time qualities of domestic work and this a little bit paradoxical condition of permanent temporariness that these labor migrants find themselves in. And the project at NEC is part of my thesis. It is envisioned actually as my last chapter. And yeah, I'm trying to look into this condition of permanent temporariness and maybe try to answer this question, which is often posed by migration scholars, why there's nothing as permanent as a temporary migrant.
Could you tell us more about the context of your research? I mean, where is the location and the duration of your research, the kind of methodological tools you've employed?
I derive my insights from ethnographic fieldwork. Over the past 3 years, I have been on and off in Italy for a few times. I think I would accumulate of about 6 months of ethnographic fieldwork. Mostly I have been conducting interviews in the regions of Emilia, Romagna and Veneto, which are the regions with the highest concentration of Moldovans. I have been based in Padova, which is the capital of Moldovans in Italy. This should be noted. And yes, I have been conducting interviews, I have been conducting also observation, trying to observe as much as possible their lives and participate in their everydayness. Being Moldovan also helped.
Who are these migrants?
Well, Moldova as a country has been mostly affected by migration. It's maybe one of the countries which is affected by migration the most. It is still a recent phenomenon, let's say, because migration, or Moldovans discovered migration as a way out of a situation of crisis only recently, that let's say 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, in the early 2000s. And yeah, the situation was complicated in Moldova due to this economic crisis. There was this delayed payments of salaries, people couldn't afford the basic expenses. So this is when they started to explore migration as a way out. And we should note migration as a temporary way out, because the majority of the projects were meant to be temporary. They didn't have a length of stay longer than 1 year or 2 years. This was a purely instrumental departure. They had a specific aim in mind, usually to achieve something practical, to renovate the house, to pay for the education of children, or to maybe buy a house. Some of them didn't have a house. So once this aim being achieved, they were set to return. And of course, when you envision yourself as temporary, you do have a specific type of behavior. Like you are mostly interested to, make the most of your time in the host country so that you can return faster or as soon as possible. But as it happens, this initial deadline that they had has been revised continuously, and 1 year or 2 years turned into 15, 20 years, and as years go by, they push forward this departure while still not abandoning the return as a plan. And as a consequence, as a result, they behave as temporary migrants on a permanent basis. So this is where this paradoxical condition comes in, because once you behave as temporary for 15, 20 years, you already qualify as a permanent migrant, and you still maintain a type of behavior which may prove to be detrimental to your annual life plans, let's say.
There are many Moldovans in Italy
yes,
in comparison to
yes.
other...
There are two main destinations for Moldovans. It is all known Russia, but Italy is the main EU destination.
Mm-hmm.
And currently the community is quite large. It has multiplied maybe 10 times in the past decade, so it's still growing. And I think currently we can speak about 150,000 of Moldovans legally residing in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
But the numbers, I guess, are much higher because a lot of them are registered as Romanian residents. So the community is large, and it started as an explorative way, right, channel to go there. But then the networks attracted other networks and just multiplied into this, self-perpetuating migration system. So, yeah, it might even grow in the near future. Let's say right now it's pretty stable.
What are their economic strategies and their status in Italy? You said that they are legal migrants, a large part of them, but also illegal ones. I mean, which are
how do they come about? Right. So in my thesis, I look at migration through a threefold temporal lens, let's say. First, I look at this processuality, how they found migration as a way out and how they explored this channel of survival, let's say. So I look at the stages of migration, and by stages I mean the fact that what precedes migration, especially in terms of, in conditions of restricted migration, because back in the 2000s, early 2000s, there were these mobility restrictions. They could not cross the border that easy. They had to be creative somehow to be able to cross the border. So in the first part of my thesis, I actually explore this stage 0, as I call it, in migration. How did they discover migration in this climate of very scarce information and also restricted mobility? Because in some cases, this preparation to go abroad has lasted even 6 months. They really had to be creative to find these channels, and to it was also a very risky endeavor because they have incurred huge debts to be able to pay to be able to cross the border. So it started largely as through irregular border crossings. Some of them managed to get a visa, but once they got there, they obviously, once they crossed illegally the border, they ended up as undocumented or irregular, or if they came with a visa, they have overstayed the time allowed by that visa, so they also ended up as irregular. So they did survive in the shadows. They still had to find work, accommodation, be able to come up with some survival strategies, and strategically wait for an amnesty, for one of these regular sessions of amnesties, which was granted by Italian government. But this was pretty random, so they didn't know when this would happen. So the main strategy was just to make a living somehow in the shadows and wait for this amnesty that would come. And this would allow them the chance to regularize their status. Once regularizing their status, they could pay their first visit home. And in many cases, this first visit home functioned as a reality check, which determined, in a way, a revision of the path that they set upon. Either they decided to stay, to return for good, like being satisfied with the savings that they had at that point, or many more decided to go back to Italy and with a more oriented outlook for a longer settlement or for a little longer. How long this little longer would last, they didn't know, and it has been unclear for the past decade. So this is what I'm looking also in the project at NEC. How long does this little longer in their minds and in reality last?
Permanent temporariness, it's an oxymoronic expression, but captures this contradiction and tensions in migration processes and the way people plan and envisage their future in such a situation. Are there any strategies like to become part of local society, the way to make their lives better? Do they envisage integration in Italian society, or the pull back to Moldova is still strong?
Well, there are different types of migrants. There are different categories, obviously, and there are some migrants who, once, as I mentioned, having regularized their status, then they could afford thinking on a longer term. Okay, so now what do I do? Do I return to Moldova, or I can envision my stay here on a longer term, and maybe it is worth investing in my stay here and in my integration, and maybe improving my skills on the labor market and getting a better livelihood. But of it, and like when living abroad, when you go abroad, we can assume that you have a temporal horizon in mind anyways. There are some who even have from the very outset a very open-ended perspective, and usually these are the young, unmarried, and they don't have any constraints of sorts, so they can afford that their path can evolve in either direction, either coming back or staying, or it's like being deliberately unpredictable. They can afford that. But then there is this certain category of people, of migrants, if they are married, if they're mothers, if they have children in the home country, if they have husbands who are dependables they have to care for, they can't really afford the luxury or afford the possibility to think of themselves. If they cannot bring their families back to Italy, then obviously it doesn't make sense for them to invest in their stay or to reorient themselves on a longer term in Italy. So it makes sense to look at each category in terms of what are the constraints that determine a certain migration path. And if we speak of labor migrants, I need to emphasize that they are, if they are temporary, then they are money savers, they are goal-oriented, they're not interested in leading a social life or they're not interested in putting a lot of effort in social integration. They're interested to maximize their work time and to minimize anything else which is secondary to their migration aim, because the longer, they have a goal that they have to achieve. And as a result, like what I'm looking is like what is it like to behave as temporary but on a such long frame, right? Because after 15, 20 years after, you have changed as a person. A lot of things happened in the home country as well. Inevitably, there are lots of, emotional costs added to this kind of endeavor. Relationships ratify, or, there is this inevitable entrenchments between spouses, even between mothers and children. You as a person change, and like I'm intrigued to look at how you maintain out of inertia maybe this kind of behavior which you set for yourself at the beginning of your migration, and you keep on enacting this behavior despite of the fact that a lot of things changed in the meantime, and you do that without revising somehow the variables in the equation that you got yourself caught in. I can I mean, what I'm looking at is I'm illustrating what does it mean to behave like that. And of course, you know, professionally it means keeping this kind of low paid, low status type of job, and also socially stigmatized. And in the case of domestic workers, this is my focus, it also means being socially confined or isolated in the household, doing this type of work, which working in the household of Italians means not having a clear division between your own space and their space, between the working time, your private free time. So there are a lot of things, a lot of also consequences for your mental health for doing this type of job. Then, as I mentioned, there are emotional costs to that. There is this inevitable alienation that happens with them on this long time frame. And anyways, being separated from your family, you know, like it is this constant craving to be somewhere else, to be sometime else. Even this homesickness can be understood as a temporal longing, because you are here in Italy as a migrant, but you're temporarily connected to your home country, to your family. You're, like, I have these women, they're mothers, they are wives, but they're still the managers of their household. So they manage everything from a distance, you know, they're still connected to what happens. They can tell me with precision what is going on right now in their household, what is their son doing, what is their husband doing, what are the expenses. So they're very, very much oriented, and they're like, there are multiple timescapes at play in their minds, which they have to, you know, manage and keep, you know, manage.
It's a fascinating perspective on migration, looking at this, managing timescapes, temporal orientations, involvements, different frames. Would people go back to Moldova? I mean, that would be a way out of this state of permanent temporariness, or is it a solution going back for people envisaged as such?
I mean, they keep in mind this plan, right? Mm-hmm. They still look up to this perspective that at some point they will go to Moldova. In the meantime, migration has created this context of, has increased in many cases the standards, the living standards of their families. And as a result, other needs arise and multiply. So it is also like a little bit of a vicious circle that it's created, and very hard to break. And my understanding of this paradoxical situation is that because there are so many factors that they are not really in control of, or maybe outside their power, they simply concentrate on these short-term needs that keep multiplying, right? So they concentrate on those and a little bit like disregarding the long time frame or the long-term effects of this kind of behavior. Because I would assume that in their understanding, the benefits of concentrating or of meeting those needs right now are greater than the long-term benefits, which might look abstract to them. Like if we think in terms of pension schemes, or many of them, for instance, prefer to, and I guess temporariness is the reason that they do that. Many of them prefer to keep this type of informal work agreements, that is without a proper contract with their employer, so that they can pay less taxes. But in the long run, like if they are middle-aged or women of advanced age, they will need the proper health care access or something to contribute to their pension, So this might prove very detrimental in the long run. But in a way, for them, the benefits of meeting the needs on the short term seem larger and more real than what might occur in the long term.
You've been here at NEC for a year almost, and there were also other projects on migration. What is your experience being a fellow here throughout this year?
Well, it has been in many ways ideal for me, because I really needed a quiet place and a supportive environment to be able to finish off my thesis. And this is what I have actually applied. I have applied with the last chapter of my thesis. So mission is accomplished. I have managed to submit a first draft of my thesis. So it has been, well, let's see what comes. I expect many rounds of revisions after that. But in a way, it has been very a productive time for me. I have managed to write, and I can only be grateful for the support that has been offered to me here. And as far as I'm concerned, it is interdisciplinary. We are a very diverse cohort of people, but I had also the benefit of having in our cohort some people I really admire and look up to, and whose feedback has been really useful for me. Migration scholars even, like Alina Cucu or Ioana Bunescu or Neda Deneva. So I'm very grateful for having this opportunity for sharing this fellowship and for having the chance to discuss with them aspects of my research.
And your future plans?
I'm keeping also an open-ended approach in terms of life planning, deliberately unpredictable.
But the goal-oriented perspective in your case would be defending your PhD.
Exactly, and then go with the flow and see what. Obviously, I wanna go and remain in academia and maybe go on with researching. I look forward in replicating this temporal approach also in other phenomena with other professional groups, not only on migration, but maybe going further. And
Olga, thank you very much for talking to us, and good luck
for
the future.
Thank you so much.